Thank you, Mr Acting Speaker, and I'd like to take a few moments to make a contribution to this important bill. Mr Speaker, before I go into some individual issues, I'd just like to indicate that a lot of what I'm going to say is actually based on a report prepared for me by this year's intern, university intern, Susan Roberts, Adelaide University student, and she's done a wonderful job with her report. And that while I had some ideas, she's done the research, and she's done some extensive research, and actually her thinking is exquisite in the sense that she's really gone really deep and really taken a really broad view and put in Aboriginal rights, etc., in a broader context. And her paper is essentially about the well-being of Aboriginal people, First Nations people in this country. And the topic, and it's relevant to this, Mr Acting Speaker, the topic was actually, and I'll provide some more details, has the well-being of First Nation Australians been adversely affected by well-meaning but ultimately misguided policies? Yes, here, that's right. And without being too critical, I think this bill is well-meaning, but I also think it's misguided, and therefore will have a negative impact on our First Nations people. And it's interesting because her conclusion to her report says as follows. After a thorough theoretical analysis and examination of key policy periods, that the well-being of First Nations Australians has been adversely affected by well-meaning but ultimately misguided policies. And then she goes a whole range of examples and some recommendations, and I'll come to those because they are very much relevant to this bill. Mr Speaker, in terms of this bill, the bill is supposed to respond, from my understanding, for what the Premier and the Minister for Aboriginal Affairs has said, to respond to the Uluru Statement from the Heart. But I think my understanding of this bill is that it only deals with one of the three issues. It only deals with the issue of voice, and even the issue of voice has its issues, which I'll talk about in a moment. It doesn't deal with the issue of truth and treaty. As I said, the voice in this bill is not a proper voice. It is actually just a voice to a new parliamentary committee, and as the member for Narangga indicated, even he has some difficulties with this bill, and in terms of the way the voice it's given to the First Nations people. Contrast to that, Mr Acting Speaker, the South Australian Labor Party is committed in July 2019 to a state-based implementation of the Uluru Statement. My first concern about this bill, in terms of the voice, is that the Aboriginal representative body has 0 elected members. And however, once elections are held, only 5 of the 13 members will be directly elected, 2 will be indirectly elected and nominated by existing elected Aboriginal bodies. The rest will be appointed. When I saw this proposed structure and model for a voice for First Nations people, I thought about the tours when I do tours of Parliament with students. And when we talk about about responsible government, I talk about how our first government was effectively a governor on behalf of the English sovereign, and he or she, and I think it was all he's at the time, he literally ran the colony. He then set up an advisory council appointed, and then that advisory council was then half elected, I understand, and then we actually had the first legislative council, which was fully elected. And that seems what we seem to be repeating today in relation to the Aboriginal Representative Body Bill. What we are saying is Aboriginal people, First Nations people, are not ready for self-determination. That's what this bill says. In the same way, the English sovereign and British Parliament said back in the 1840s and 50s, this colony wasn't ready for responsible government, self-government. So this bill actually takes us back to colonial days. And that's how we're treating our First Nation people, like we did treat them in colonial days, because the so-called voice is a colonial day model. Not directly elected, not formed by the opinions of people that is affected by it, but in that paternalistic way which has pervaded our policies over decades in relation to First Nations people. And I do object to that. I think Aboriginal First Nation people have the time has come and have the ability to actually have a voice in this state. And so that's my first concern. My understanding also, and I'm happy to be corrected, my understanding is also that the consultation of the bill has been seen to be inadequate and flawed, and it was only open for 9 days of consultation. Now, I'd find it hard to consult with my community in 9 days, or any community organisation in my electorate in 9 days. So how you consult with First Nations people right across the state in 9 days properly and in an effective way is beyond me. I don't think it's possible to do it properly. You can do it in a tokenistic way, perhaps what I said earlier, but a colonial way. And the issue I have about that is one of the concerns raised by Susan Robertson, who researched. And she addresses the issue. She says, legacies of colonial thinking which promote an individualistic philosophy of thinking rather than a collectivist view have and continue to influence wellbeing policies in Australia. In other ways, we are doing this process as white Western people would do it. If it was a true consultation process, we would use the consultation process used by First Nation people and how they get together and discuss things over time, etc. So this is not about honouring and respecting First Nation people. This is about us imposing the way we do things. Sadly, it appears we've learnt nothing in over 150 years. We're still doing the things we did back in colonial days, which I outlined a bit earlier. And I think that is important. We need to learn from our previous mistakes, because anything we do as parliaments and as governments is about the well-being of the people. In this case, the well-being of our First Nations people. And one of the other findings Susan makes is that Western quality of life measures cannot adequately capture the interconnected nature of First Nations well-being. And that means First Nations people see their well-being, seeing their being differently to what we do as white Western people. And any model of governance which talks about First Nations people should adopt First Nation philosophies. We should adopt those and come together with Western philosophy, not impose our philosophy upon them. Mr. Speaker, the bill, in my opinion, does not reflect, if you like, the essence or the meaning of the statement, the Uluru Statement from the Heart. And I mentioned the voice bit, which this bill is supposed to create. I don't think it meets the requirements of that statement at the state level. And that's no conclusion I can reach in terms of what the First Nations people are seeking. In terms of the second element, the treaty element, and I'll quote from the report, because to do anything else would be an injustice to this report, because she's done a wonderful job. And quoting from the report, she quotes Noel Pearson, who's well known to all Australians, describes the meaning, and this is about treaty, the meaning of the word makarata, and the Yongala concept of makarata captures the idea of two parties coming together after a struggle, healing the divisions of the past. It is about acknowledging that something has been done wrong and it seeks to make things right. And that's what treaty is about, is that process of doing that. And it's relevant to the extent of this bill because I think we should use those principles in forming this bill and in this new body. And we haven't. We haven't. We haven't done that. Because, Mr. Acting Speaker, I think we need to do that. The other element is the Uluru Statement is about truth. Now, in terms of truth, and I can again quote from Susan's report, a truth-telling process that completely exposes the previous injustice First Nations people have endured since colonisation and the ongoing effects this has had on their well-being. This would encourage a greater understanding of Australian history amongst its citizens and assist in proper reconciliation. This bill is about forming a body which would advise Parliament and the government on how we proceed to actually reduce the gap between white Western Australians and First Nations Australians. But again, I do not think this process, neither the process nor this bill does that. Again, I think that the Uluru Statement from the Heart has its significance, I think, is not well understood. Sadly, it's been dismissed by the Federal Liberal Party in the way they behaved. That's my interpretation. The others may disagree, but certainly hasn't been. I think the previous Prime Minister made some token efforts. Then the current Prime Minister, I don't think he's even done that. And again, I'll quote Susan's report. Overall, the Uluru Statement of the Heart is not a list of demands, rather a means of finding common ground between First Nation Australians and non-First Nation Australians. And as quoted by Dean Parkin, a Quandamooka man and signatory of the document, it is not a submission or a petition to the government, it is an invitation to you, the Australian people. And then it goes on to quote Illawarra woman Pat Anderson when she says, "We meaningfully and consciously give the Uluru Statement from the Heart as a gift to the Australian people. It's a gift of healing and indeed love. We don't often like to use that word, but you know, it's a very emotional document." So the Uluru Statement of the Heart is about establishing some principles, a process where First Nations and non-First Nations people can come together, find common ground, and, as we're told at various ceremonies, walk together from now on. While this bill, I think, is a part of that process and seeks to do that, Mr. Acting Speaker, I'll come back to Susan's examination of this subject area where she says, "The well-being of First Nation Australians has been adversely affected by well-meaning but ultimately misguided policies." And I think this is another example of well-meaning. I don't wish to suggest it's any ill meaning, but it is misguided. And certainly people in my community would have some problems with that. Mr. Acting Speaker, I think if I wanted to summarise and conclude my comments, is that to do this properly, if we're going to do this, we do it properly. If we have to do it properly, it means genuine engagement. And genuine engagement usually reflects a respect for the other parties, and it's also time for self-determination. A bill which sets up the structure for a voice based on colonial principles is certainly not the way to go.